The deep crimson of the hibiscus cocktail bled into the ivory silk of Seo-Yuna's dress, spreading like an accusation. For a heartbeat, the high-end lounge went silent, the clink of ice and jazz fading into a vacuum of terror. Seo-Yuna's hand remained frozen in midair, the empty glass she had just accidentally knocked out of Imani's tray clattering onto the table. "Kneel," Seo-Yuna hissed, her voice a sharp blade that sliced through the stillness of the Seoul elite. "Scrub it out. Now." In the past, waitresses had vanished for less. The room held its breath, expecting the usual display of trembling submission. But Imani Walker didn't move. She didn't drop to her knees, and she didn't offer a frantic apology. Instead, she stood with a spine made of iron, her posture controlled and her gaze level. She looked Seo-Yuna in the eye, not with malice, but with a terrifying moral calm. "It's a stain, not a death sentence," Imani said, her voice steady enough to make the guests recoil. "And I don't kneel for anyone. Is there a problem here?" The voice was low, vibrating with a power that required no shouting. Park Min-jae stepped out of the velvet shadows of his private booth, his arms crossed over a tailored black suit. He didn't look at his fiancée's ruined dress. He didn't look at the spilled drink. His dark, unreadable eyes were fixed entirely on the waitress who dared to stand tall. The silence he brought with him was more dangerous than Seo-Yuna's screaming. It was the silence of a predator who had just found something far more interesting than his dinner. Imani felt the heat of Min-jae's stare, but she refused to let her hand shake. "Remember why you're here," she told herself, the thought of her brother's tuition bill in the U.S. acting as her anchor. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to be the black waitress who was just passing through, a ghost in a uniform. But as Seo-Yuna's face contorted in a mask of disheveled fury and Min-jae's lips thinned into a curious, cold line, Imani knew the time for staying invisible was over. The morning after the incident at the lounge, Seoul felt different, sharper, colder, and far more observant. Imani walked down the narrow, winding streets of her neighborhood, her breath blooming in the crisp air like pale ghosts. Usually, the city felt like a sea she could drown in, a place where a black woman in a simple coat was just another face in the crowd of 10 million. But today, the calculated invisibility she had spent months perfecting felt like it had been stripped away, leaving her skin raw to the wind. Every click of her heels against the pavement seemed to echo too loudly. She kept her head high, her spine retaining that same iron rigidity she had displayed when she refused to kneel for Seo-Yuna. She didn't regret it. The memory of the fiancé's shocked, recoiling face was a small fire that kept her warm, even as the weight of her brother's future pressed against her chest. She had already sent the bulk of her last paycheck home. Andre was safe, his tuition was paid for the semester, and that was all that mattered. She could handle a little heat if it meant he never had to know the cold. But as she turned the corner toward her favorite coffee stand, a prickle of unease crawled up the back of her neck. It wasn't the usual curiosity of passers-by. It was a heavy, deliberate pressure. She didn't look back. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her bag and caught her reflection in a shop window. Behind her, half a block away, a black sedan crawled at a snail's pace, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky. When she stopped, it stopped. When she crossed the street, it followed a minute later, a silent shadow in the urban labyrinth. Imani ducked into a crowded subway station, her heart beginning a frantic rhythm. She moved through the throng of commuters, weaving between businessmen and students, hoping to lose herself in the sheer volume of humanity. She felt the eyes before she saw the men. Two of them. They weren't wearing the flash suits of the lounge. They were dressed in nondescript techwear, but they moved with a synchronized predatory grace that gave them away. They weren't looking at the subway maps. They were looking at her. They weren't Seo-Yuna's thugs. Seo-Yuna would have sent someone loud, someone meant to cause a scene and humiliate her. These men were different. They were silent, professional, and terrifyingly patient. They were Park Min-jae's men. Imani leaned against a pillar, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the small locket beneath her shirt. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Min Jae hadn't forgotten the girl who had looked him in the eye. He hadn't dismissed her as a fluke. He was studying her, tracking her every move as if she were a piece on a board he was just beginning to play. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a target of interest for the most dangerous man in the country. The glass ceiling she had lived under hadn't just cracked. It was beginning to shatter, and the men in the shadows were waiting to see which way the shards would fall. Imani took a deep breath, forced her hands to be still, and stepped onto the arriving train. She would keep moving. She would stay focused. But as the doors hissed shut, she saw one of the men step into the next car, his gaze meeting hers through the glass with a terrifying, unreadable calm. The hunt had begun. The following Tuesday, a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the lounge, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The evening rush had been cleared out early, and the glittering chandeliers seemed to dim in anticipation. Imani stood in the kitchen, smoothing the front of her uniform, her fingers grazing the locket she always wore for luck. She could feel the stares of the other servers, eyes filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They knew the order that had come down from the top floor. Table 4, the manager whispered, his face ashen, refusing to look her in the eye. Private service. He specifically asked for you, Imani. Don't speak unless he prompts you. Just be careful. Imani nodded once, her expression a mask of moral defiance. She didn't feel like a victim led to slaughter. She felt like a soldier entering a parley. She picked up the heavy silver tray and stepped out into the main room. The lounge was empty of its usual vanity. In the center of the room, under a single directed spotlight, sat Park Min Jae. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked as though they were carved from granite. He wasn't looking at the menu or his phone. He was looking at the entrance, waiting for her. Sit, he said as she approached. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried the absolute authority of a man who had never been told no. Imani set the bottle of sparkling water on the table, but remained standing. I'm on the clock, Mr. Park. It's against policy for staff to fraternize with the guests. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something human in his unreadable eyes, a dry, dark amusement. I own the lounge, the staff, and the ground you're standing on. The policy is whatever I say it is. Seat. Imani pulled out the velvet chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She sat with her back perfectly straight, her hands folded on the table. She didn't fidget. She didn't look down. She met his gaze with a level of inner strength that seemed to surprise him. For a long minute, Min Jae simply studied her. He wasn't looking at her as a man looks at a beautiful woman, nor as a boss looks at an employee. He was dissecting her. He was looking for the crack in her armor, the moment where the black waitress would finally blink and show the fear he was accustomed to. I watched you with Seo Yuna, he said finally, leaning forward into the light. Everyone in this city bows to her because they know she is an extension of me. But you stood there like she was nothing, like I was nothing. Tell me, Imani Walker, where does a woman like you get the nerve to ignore the most dangerous man in Seoul? I don't ignore you, Mr. Park, Imani replied, her voice steady and clear. I just don't fear you. Fear is for people who have something to lose that can be taken by a man with a gun. My dignity isn't something you can take. I have to give it to you, and I've decided not to. Min Jae's expression didn't change, but the air between them grew thick with a sudden electric tension. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers on the table. He didn't touch her. This wasn't about the physical, but the heat from his skin was palpable. You think your spirit is unbreakable because you've survived a hard life in America, he murmured, his eyes darkening. You think you're better than the sycophants in this room because you have principles. But principles are a luxury for people who don't know how quickly the world can turn cold. I know exactly how cold the world is, Imani countered, thinking of the weight of her brother's tuition and the long nights spent working for people who didn't know her name. That's why I keep my fire. If I let you or your fiancé put it out, I'd be as dead as the people you have buried in the hills. The silence that followed was deafening. Min Jae didn't move. He continued to interrogate her spirit with that piercing gaze, looking for a lie, a tremor, a hint of greed. He found none. "You're a dangerous woman," he said softly, a statement of fact. "Not because you have power, but because you don't want mine. That makes you a variable I can't control." "Then let me go back to my work," Imani said, starting to rise. "No," Min-jae said, his hand finally dropping to the table with a firm thud. "The game has already changed, Imani. Seo-yuna doesn't forgive, and I don't forget. Whether you like it or not, you're no longer invisible." As Imani walked away, she felt his eyes boring into her back. She had survived the interrogation, but as she caught her reflection in the glass of the bar, she realized she was no longer just a waitress. She was a challenge, and in Min-jae's world, challenges were either mastered or destroyed. The morning air in Imani's small studio apartment felt violated, the heavy scent of expensive, cloying perfume clashing with the metallic tang of fear. She had returned from her shift to find her world turned inside out. The dresser drawers were pulled out, her clothes strewn across the floor like discarded skins, and her mattress had been sliced open, the stuffing spilling out like synthetic snow. Imani stood in the center of the wreckage, her breath hitching as she saw her brother's framed high school graduation photo lying shattered on the floor, the glass spiderwebbed over his smiling face. It was a surgical strike, deliberate, cruel, and silent. Nothing of monetary value was missing, but the message was louder than a scream. "I can find you anywhere." A heavy thud at the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. Before she could reach the handle, it swung open to reveal two men in dark, nondescript suits accompanied by a local officer. The officer didn't look at the chaos of the room. His eyes remained fixed on a digital tablet in his hand, his expression one of bored bureaucracy. "Imani Walker?" he asked, his voice devoid of empathy. "What is this?" Imani demanded, her voice shaking but her eyes burning with that same moral defiance she had shown at the lounge. "My home has been broken into. I need to file a report. Someone was just here." The officer ignored her plea, stepping over a pile of her books. "There is a discrepancy with your E-7 work visa. A formal complaint was filed this morning by an anonymous source alleging that your credentials from the United States were falsified to bypass immigration protocols. Your status has been flagged as fraudulent." "That's impossible," Imani countered, her heart sinking into her stomach like a stone. "I have the original transcripts. I worked for 2 years to get that paperwork processed. I've done everything by the book." "The book says you are here illegally until an investigation is completed," the officer said, his voice flat. "Your passport has been remotely invalidated. You are prohibited from leaving the country, but you are also prohibited from working. You have 24 hours to vacate this property, as your lease is tied to your employment status." The speed of it was dizzying. In less than 10 minutes, the life she had painstakingly built to support her brother was being dismantled. As they led her out of the building, the cool soul rain began to fall, slicking the pavement. A black sedan with tinted windows sat idling across the street, its engine a low, predatory hum. The rear window rolled down just an inch, revealing a flash of perfectly manicured fingers and the cold, triumphant eyes of Yoon Seo-yuna. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The smirk playing on her lips said it all. This was the price of standing tall. Seo-yuna wasn't just trying to deport her. She was stripping Imani of her dignity, her livelihood, and her safety piece by agonizing piece. Standing on the sidewalk, clutching the shattered photo of her brother to her chest, Imani felt the crushing weight of the invisible life she had lost. She was no longer just a waitress or a ghost in the city. She was a woman caught between a vengeful queen and a silent king. And as the sedan pulled away, she realized that to survive the first strike, she would have to step directly into the path of the man who had been watching her from the shadows. The black sedan didn't take Imani to a police station or a detention center. It glided through the reinforced iron gates of a sprawling fortress nestled in the high cliffs of Pyeongchang-dong. When the door opened, Park Min-jae was waiting at the top of the granite stairs, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of a mansion that looked more like a sanctuary for a king than a home. He looked down at Imani, her clothes damp from the rain, her eyes burning with a mixture of exhaustion and moral defiance, and simply gestured for her to enter. Your apartment is no longer yours. Your name has been erased from every system in this city, Min Jae said, his voice a low, steady vibration in the cool night air. Here, you exist only because I say you do. In these walls, Seo Yuna is a ghost with no haunting rights. The estate was a masterpiece of cold glass and silent stone, but to Imani, it felt like a mausoleum. Min Jae led her to a suite on the third floor, a room draped in silks and fine linens that felt like a mockery of her current state. You will stay here, he stated, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze never leaving her face. In exchange, you will act as my personal liaison. You will be at my side during meetings. You will be the one person in this house who doesn't lie to me out of fear. Imani looked at the opulence surrounding her, her fingers tracing the edge of a mahogany desk that cost more than her brother's entire college education. You've traded one cage for another, Mr. Park. You think because the bars are gold and the sheets are silk, I won't notice I'm a prisoner. I'm giving you a life, he countered, stepping closer until the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. Seo Yuna was going to give you a grave. Learn the difference before you decide to be ungrateful. The true nature of that life revealed itself over the following days. Imani was no longer a waitress, but she was far from a guest. As she followed Min Jae through the lower levels of the estate, the parts the architects hadn't meant for the public to see, the inner strength she prided herself on was forged in a fire of cold, hard reality. She saw the back rooms where men with bruised knuckles whispered about disruptions in shipping routes and the removal of obstacles. She stood in the corner of his study as he signed documents that she realized were not for legitimate trade, but for the movement of ghost fleets and silent, untraceable capital. The calculating invisibility she had once used to survive the lounge was now her greatest tool for observation. One evening, passing a heavy soundproof door in the basement level, she caught a glimpse of the violent truth that sat beneath Min Jae's tailored suits. A man sat tied to a chair, his face a map of swelling and blood, while one of Min Jae's lieutenants spoke in a calm, terrifyingly rhythmic monotone. There was no screaming, only the heavy, wet thud of a blunt object hitting flesh. Imani froze, her breath catching in her throat, the shattered photo of her brother feeling like a lead weight in her pocket. This was the foundation of the palace. This was the man who had sat across from her, at the table for one. Min Jae appeared behind her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He didn't try to close the door or hide the scene. Now you see it, he whispered against her ear, his breath warm against her skin. The world is not judged by how people treat those who could do nothing for them, Imani. It is ruled by those who have the power to do everything to them. Do you still want to be the only one who doesn't bow? Imani turned to face him, her eyes burning with a mixture of horror and an unbreakable, furious resolve. She didn't flinch from the blood on the floor or the darkness in his eyes. More than ever, she whispered back, her voice like iron. Because if I bow now, I'm just like you. Min Jae's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of something that looked dangerously like respect flickering in his dark eyes. The golden cage had been opened, but as Imani looked at the man before her, she realized the most dangerous part of being his liaison wasn't the violence she had just witnessed. It was the fact that she was beginning to see the man behind the monster. The storm outside the estate was a violent symphony, rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the study like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to break in. Inside, however, the air was thick with a heavy, crackling silence. The only light came from the low amber glow of the fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows across the mahogany shelves and the sharp, obsidian lines of Park Min Jae's desk. Imani stood by the window, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the dark Seoul skyline. She had traded her polyester waitress uniform for a lounge set of deep charcoal silk, a gift from the golden cage that felt far too soft against her skin. She didn't turn when she heard the clink of glass. She knew Min Jae was there, stripped of his tailor blazer, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "You're remarkably quiet tonight," Min Jae remarked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards. "I'm thinking about the man in the basement," Imani replied, finally turning to face him. Her eyes drifted to his exposed forearms, catching the jagged, silver-white line of a scar that ran from his wrist up toward his elbow. "It was old but deep, and I'm wondering if that's how you got that." Min Jae looked down at his arm, a bitter, hollow shadow crossing his face. He didn't cover it. Instead, he traced the mark with his thumb, his expression unreadable. This wasn't from a rival or a debt collector. This was a lesson from my father. I was 14, and I had shown unnecessary mercy to a boy who had stolen from our warehouses. He wanted to make sure I never forgot the price of soft heart. Imani felt a sharp, unexpected pang of recognition, not of the brutality, but of the weight of a legacy you never asked for. She stepped closer, her hand instinctively reaching toward the hollow of her collarbone, hidden beneath the silk. "I have one too," she whispered, "from a different kind of fire." Min Jae stepped into the light of the fire, his dark eyes searching hers. For the first time, he didn't look like a predator. He looked like a man who was tired of wearing a mask. "Show me." Imani hesitated, then slowly lowered the edge of her collar to reveal a small, puckered star of scar tissue. The night our parents died, the apartment building was an oven. I had Andre in my arms, and the door handle was white hot. I didn't feel it until we were on the sidewalk. I was so focused on making sure he didn't have a scratch on him that I didn't realize I'd burned the skin off my palm and shoulder. Min Jae reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her skin, radiating a heat that rivaled the fireplace. He didn't touch her, but the proximity felt more intimate than a kiss. "We are both defined by what we've lost," he murmured, his voice losing its iron edge. "You protect your brother with your pride. I protect my empire with my blood. But the scars, they speak the same language." In the dim light, the terrifying facade of the Mafia boss cracked. The cold, calculating distance in his eyes thawed into a profound, weary loneliness. For the first time, Imani didn't see the monster who ruled the underworld. She saw a boy who had been broken into a weapon, and a man who had forgotten what it was like to be touched without fear. "Is that why you brought me here?" Imani asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To see if my fire could survive your cold?" Min Jae finally let his hand drop, his fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve. "I brought you here because you were the only thing in this city that felt real. And because I realized that if Seo Yuna destroyed you, the last piece of my own soul would go with you." The air between them grew electric, the moral defiance that usually fueled Imani softening into something far more dangerous: empathy. As the rain continued to roar against the glass, the golden cage no longer felt like a prison. For one night, it was a sanctuary where two scarred souls could finally stop fighting the world and start seeing each other. The fragile peace of the estate shattered on a Tuesday morning, dissolved by the cold light of a laptop screen. Imani was in the small library, cataloging a shipment of rare first editions for Min Jae, when the heavy oak doors swung open with a violence that made her heart drop. Min Jae didn't enter the room with his usual measured grace. He moved like a storm front, followed closely by his lead security tech, a man whose face was pale with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Explain this," Min Jae commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't look at her with the warmth of the previous night. He looked at her as if she were a target he had finally pinned to the wall. He slammed a tablet onto the mahogany table. On the screen was a scrolling log of internal server access, a high-level encryption key, one that only Min Jae and his closest lieutenants possessed, had been used at 3 in the morning to bypass the firewall of the Kwon Group's legitimate shipping subsidiary. Millions of dollars in proprietary logistics data had been exported to an offshore server. The IP address used for the final handshake was the dedicated secure line in Imani's guest suite. "I don't understand," Imani said, her voice steady despite the ice water flooding her veins. "I was asleep at 3. I don't even know how to bypass a firewall. let alone a Mafia encryption key. The logs don't lie, Imani, the tech whispered, cringing under Min-jae's gaze. The biometric login shows your fingerprint was used on the suite's terminal. It's a perfect match. Imani felt the golden cage closing in, the bars thickening with every word. She looked at Min-jae, searching for a trace of the man who had shared his scars with her. But the mask was back, colder and harder than ever. You think I did this? After everything I told you? You think I'd risk my brother's safety for a data breach? I think, Min-jae said, stepping so close she could feel the radiating heat of his fury, that a woman who can stand up to a mafia boss without blinking is a woman capable of anything, including a very long, very deep play. Before Imani could defend herself, the library's intercom crackled. It was the gatehouse. Sir, Miss Seo-yuna is here. She says she has urgent intelligence regarding the breach. Seo-yuna entered the study minutes later, looking every bit the triumphant queen. She didn't scream or throw glass this time. Instead, she carried a slim manila folder with a sense of practiced tragedy. Oh, Min-jae, darling, she cooed, her eyes darting to Imani with a glint of lethal satisfaction. I warned you about bringing a stray into the house. My father's analysts intercepted a communication from a rival faction in the States. They were bragging about their inside woman in Seoul. They even had a name for her. The Ghost. She slid a photo out of the folder. It was a grainy surveillance shot of Imani at the Lagos airport months ago, talking to a man Imani recognized as the travel agent who had booked her flight. But in the photo, the man was highlighted as a known broker for international corporate espionage. The setup was perfect. It utilized Imani's greatest strengths, her intelligence and her unshakable calm, as evidence of her guilt. Seo-yuna had turned Imani's moral steel into a weapon against her. Min-jae looked from the photo to Imani, his dark eyes clouded with a profound, agonizing doubt. The connection they had forged by the fire seemed to evaporate, replaced by the crushing weight of his legacy. In his world, coincidence was a myth and betrayal was the only constant. Get her out of my sight, Min-jae whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. Confine her to the sub-level quarters. No phone, no internet. No one speaks to her until I decide if she's going to be interrogated or erased. As the guards took Imani's arms, she didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She simply looked at Min-jae, her eyes burning with a furious pride that even Seo-yuna's lies couldn't touch. You're making a mistake, Min-jae, she said, her voice echoing in the silent library. Not because you're arresting an innocent woman, but because you're letting her win. You're letting the monster your father made choose for you again. Min-jae didn't look up as they led her away, but his grip on the edge of the table was so tight that the wood began to groan. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in the garden of the Quan Empire, doubt always led to blood. The sub-level quarters of the estate were cold, the air tasting of damp concrete and abandonment. Imani sat on the edge of a narrow cot, her furious pride, the only thing keeping her from collapsing into the shadows. She had no phone, no clock, and no way to know if it was day or night. But she didn't need a clock to know when the world shifted from bad to catastrophic. The heavy steel door groaned open, but it wasn't Min-jae who stepped into the dim light. It was Seo-yuna. She looked radiant, her designer heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, a stark contrast to the grime of the cellar. She didn't say a word as she held up a smartphone, the screen glowing with a live video feed. Imani's heart stopped. The footage was shaky, taken from across the street in Philadelphia. It showed her brother, Andre, walking home from his evening lab, his backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware of the black SUV idling at the curb behind him. Two men in hooded sweatshirts stepped out of the vehicle, keeping a disciplined distance. He's a handsome boy, Seo-yuna remarked, her voice a silk ribbon tied around a throat. It would be such a tragedy if he didn't make it to his graduation. The police in America are so slow with random street violence, don't you think? If you touch him, Imani began, her voice a low, vibrating growl, there is no corner of this earth where I won't find you. Seo-yuna laughed, a bright, chilling sound. You're in a cage, little bird. You have no wings and no claws. But I'm feeling merciful. I don't want your life. I want your absence. Min Jae is starting to look for excuses to believe you. I need you to give him a reason to stop. Record a confession. Tell him you were working for the Americans all along. Tell him you targeted him. Do that, and I'll tell my men to drive away from your brother. Imani looked at the screen. One of the men in the video had reached into his waistband. She looked at Seo Yuna, seeing the absolute vacancy behind the woman's eyes. In that moment, the moral steel Imani had spent her life forging didn't break. It darkened. She realized that playing by the rules of right and wrong was a luxury she could no longer afford. To save the innocent, she had to become the very thing she had judged. I won't record a confession, Imani said, her voice turning unervingly calm. Because Min Jae would know I was lying. He knows my spirit too well now. Then your brother dies, Fiona snapped, her thumb hovering over the screen to send a command. Wait, Imani said, stepping into the light, her expression shifting into something cold and predatory, a mirror of the men who lived in the basement. You want me gone? A confession won't do it. He'll just hunt me down and ask why. If you want him to let me go, you need him to hate me. And for that, I need to do something truly unforgivable. I need to steal something he values more than his pride. Seo Yuna paused, her interest piqued by the sudden darkness in Imani's tone. What are you suggesting? The ledger for the Busan port, Imani whispered, the violent truth she had learned in the golden cage now becoming her currency. He keeps the physical backup in a safe behind the library's false wall. Even your father hasn't been able to get his hands on it. If I escape and take that with me, he won't just deport me. He'll erase me from his heart. And why would you do this for me? Seo Yuna asked, eyes narrowing. I'm not doing it for you. Imani hissed, stepping so close she could smell the cloying lilies on Seo Yuna's skin. I'm doing it for him. Now, give me a burner phone and a way out of these quarters. If your men don't pull back from Andre the second I have that ledger, I'll burn it and then I'll burn you. For the first time, Seo Yuna looked genuinely unsettled. She saw the dark side Imani had finally stepped into, a place where love and survival justified any sin. She handed over a small, encrypted phone. You have 1 hour. After that, the order to the hitmen stays active. As Seo Yuna left, Imani stood alone in the dark. She reached into her pocket and touched the shattered glass of her brother's photo. She was about to betray the only man who had ever truly seen her. But as she began to pick the lock of the sub-level vent, a skill she'd watched the basement lieutenants use, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a weapon. The waitress was gone. The survivor had taken her place. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a sea of crimson silk and black tuxedos, a red gala designed to project the absolute unity of the Kwan and Park empires. But beneath the swell of the orchestra and the clinking of crystal, the air fumed with the static of an impending storm. Imani moved through the periphery of the room, her presence once again reduced to the invisible status of a server. She wore the standard black waistcoat and white gloves of the catering staff, a disguise she had donned after slipping through the estate's vents and meeting Min Jae's most trusted lieutenant in the shadows of the underground garage. She wasn't there to steal the ledger. She was there because she had realized the ledger was never the prize. It was the bait for a massacre. From her vantage point by the Champagne Tower, Imani watched Min Jae. He stood at the center of the room, the cold, calm boss personified, his arms crossed as he endured the forced pleasantries of Seo Yuna's father, Chairman Park. Beside him, Seo Yuna glowed with a predatory triumph, her eyes scanning the room for the girl she thought she had successfully broken. She didn't notice the black waitress standing 10 feet away, her posture controlled and her gaze tracking the subtle movements of the guards stationed at the exits. Imani saw it first, the moral defiance in her spirit sharpening her senses. The guards at the north door weren't wearing the Kwan crest. They were leaning too heavily on their left sides, the telltale stance of men concealing submachine guns. A signal was passed, a simple nod from Chairman Park, and the music didn't just stop. It died in a discordant screech. Now, Sioyuna's voice pierced the sudden silence. No longer a silk ribbon, but a jagged shard of glass. As the first suppressed shots echoed through the hall, panic erupted. The elite of Seoul scrambled like frightened livestock, but Imani moved with the fluid, calculated invisibility she had perfected over months of service. While the assassins focused on the high-profile targets at the center of the room, Imani ducked behind the heavy velvet curtains of the service corridor. She knew this building's layout better than any of the gunmen. She had studied the blueprints in Min Jae's study during her days in the Golden Cage. She navigated the back hallways with a furious pride, bypassing the main conflict to reach the lighting booth overlooking the ballroom. Below, Min Jae was pinned behind an overturned mahogany table, his silhouette a target for 3 snipers positioned in the musicians' gallery. Imani didn't have a gun, but she had the intelligence of a survivor. She reached the master breaker, her hands steady as she recalled the violent truth of Min Jae's world. Power was only as good as one's ability to see it. With a sharp wrench of the lever, she plunged the red gala into absolute, suffocating darkness. The night vision goggles of the assassins flared into blinding white light as Imani triggered the emergency strobe system she had rewired moments before. In the disorienting flicker, the waitress skills of moving unseen became a lethal advantage. She slipped back into the ballroom, using the flashes of light to navigate. She found the primary assassin, the one Sioyuna had signaled to finish Min Jae, and used a heavy silver serving tray to catch the man across the temple. She reached Min Jae's side just as the emergency backup lights kicked in. He spun, his suppressed pistol leveled at her chest, his eyes wild with the profound doubt of the previous days. "It's me," Imani whispered, her voice like iron through the chaos. The ledger was a distraction. "Your fiancée isn't just a liar, Min Jae. She's a traitor." Min Jae looked at the fallen assassin at her feet, then back at the woman who had returned to a war zone to save him. The crack in his Mafia mask returned, but this time it wasn't born of grief. It was born of a shattering realization. He grabbed her hand, his grip crushing and protective. "Stay behind me," he growled, the coldness in his voice now directed solely at the Park family. Across the room, Sioyuna stood frozen, her disheveled hair and shocked expression revealing the instant loss of control. Her coup had failed because she had underestimated the one variable she thought she had erased. Imani Walker wasn't just a waitress or a ghost. She was the silent architect of the Park family's ruin. As Min Jae's loyalists swarmed the room to regain control, Imani stood tall beside the man she had saved, her expression one of inner strength that no amount of blood or darkness could dim. The red gala was over, and the reign of the fiancé was burning to ashes. The smoke from the gala had barely cleared before the world of Park Min Jae began to tilt on its axis. Within 48 hours, the corrupt officials who had flagged Imani's visa were in custody, and the forensic evidence of Sioyuna's digital frame-up was splashed across the morning news. Imani didn't return to the sub-level quarters or the guest suite. Instead, she stood in the center of Min Jae's study, watching as he systematically burned the last of the Park family's ledgers in the hearth. Min Jae looked different. The cold, calm mask hadn't returned. In its place was a quiet, focused intensity. He had spent the day meeting with his remaining lieutenants, but the conversation wasn't about turf or retaliation. It was about the Reformation. He was dismantling the ghost fleets, selling off the illegal shipping routes, and pivoting the Quan Group toward a future of legitimate global logistics. He was moving out of the shadows, and he was doing it with a speed that spoke of a man who finally had something to lose. Imani watched him, her inner strength tempered by the exhaustion of the battle she had survived. She had received a call from Philadelphia that morning. Andre was safe, the men in the SUV were gone, and his tuition for the next year had been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. The weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting, but as she looked at Min Jae, she realized there was one more thing that needed to be settled. "You're free, Imani," Min Jae said, turning from the fire. He held a small leather folder in his hand. "Your name is cleared." Your passport is restored. There is a flight leaving for New York tonight, and a wire transfer has been made to your account. It's more than enough for you and your brother to live comfortably for a very long time. Imani felt a sharp, cold pang in her chest. She looked at the folder, then at the man she had saved from his own life. Is that what you want? For me to be another person who took your money and disappeared? Min-jae stepped closer, the sandalwood and ozone scent of him filling her senses. For the first time, he didn't cross his arms. He reached out, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly as he cupped her face. What I want is a life I don't deserve. I want to build something that isn't built on blood. But I don't know how to do that without the only person who was brave enough to tell me the truth. He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't need the theater of a Mafia proposal. Instead, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and set on the table between them. Inside sat a ring of obsidian and white gold, a fusion of strength and light. I'm not asking you to be a Mafia boss's fiancée, Min-jae whispered, his dark eyes searching hers with a profound, weary loneliness that was finally finding hope. I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal. Stay and help me turn this empire into something our families can be proud of. Stay and be the new queen of a world that actually deserves you. Imani looked at the ring, then at the man who had abandoned his mask for her. She thought of the furious pride that had brought her to Seoul and the moral steel that had kept her alive. She realized that she wasn't just a waitress who had survived. She was the architect of a new reality. She didn't want to run away from the man who had shared his scars with her. She wanted to build a world where those scars were the only reminders of the darkness. I don't kneel, Min-jae, she said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. I know, he replied, his eyes softening into a genuine, rare warmth. That's why I'm standing. She reached out, her fingers lacing through his, and let him slide the ring onto her finger. The golden cage was gone.